We are currently living in a golden age of choice with regards to cameras. This is particularly amazing for those of you who have wanted a career as a video creator or filmmaker in any capacity. Nearly every camera on the market today is capable of producing a really good image. So this leaves the more important questions, such as what are you willing to give up to get your high quality image, and what kind of experience do you want to have when you get it? The Blackmagic 6K full frame truly makes you ask these questions because unlike many other cameras on the market, it is definitely not trying to be a Swiss Army knife camera that will fit every situation. I think that's also what makes it more special than you might expect at first. So today I'm going to explore the physical design of this camera, my experience using this camera for the last 5 weeks, and where I think this camera sits in the market and who it's for. This video is sponsored by Amaran, more on them a bit later. When I first started using the Blackmagic 6K full frame, I was quickly reminded why many people were a little disappointed when it was originally announced. This is a filmmaking camera trapped in a run and gun style body that doesn't come with the usual upsides of this style body, making this camera feel like it's in conflict with itself. On the one hand, it's best used on a set where you have done a lot of work in pre-production and really planned out all aspects of your shoot. On the other hand, you have to solve a lot of the technical problems that come with shooting a mirrorless style body in that setting. I did a mix of shooting with this camera stripped back with no rigging, and I used this camera on a small documentary project as a B-cam to my Ursa Mini 12K. So it was the perfect opportunity to have a well-rounded experience with it. Despite the cinema camera naming difference, if you have used a Blackmagic pocket camera in the last few years, not much has changed here. It's the same 5-inch 1500 nits display, button layout, and I/O, with the key differences being the new L mount, full frame sensor, and single CF Express Type B slot. I think Blackmagic's choice to move towards L mount is a good one because this opens up a lot more lens options as well as adapters to make up for the fact that this camera does not have built-in ND filters. From a material standpoint, the body of the Blackmagic 6K full frame feels budget and plasticky. If you find yourself populating every port on this camera, particularly using mini XLR to full-size XLR adapter cables, cable management gets messy and cumbersome quickly. For those who are curious, here is a quick audio test of the internal preamps. This is a quick test of the preamps in the Blackmagic 6K full frame. I have a Sennheiser 416 shotgun mic right above me, and it is going directly into the camera via an XLR cable. Let me know what you guys think of the sound quality of this in the comments down below. Personally, I am not a huge fan of this body. It feels clunky, oversized, and it is awkward to rig, so getting your setup dialed in can be a frustrating experience. I wish I could have used the camera stripped back for simplicity, given the body's shape, but for my needs on this recent doc shoot, it was important to minimize media and battery swaps because we were running long takes throughout the project. For my setup, I didn't have a cage during my loaner period, so I ended up rigging the camera with my SSD top handle and V-mount battery plate from Condor Blue, along with a 5-inch external monitor. My main point on rigging is that this camera will take a decent amount more trial and error to operate the way you want personally versus other cameras I've used in the past. Depending on the way you would like to shoot, you can of course use this camera bare bones. You will just need to have a lot of these Sony MPF batteries and CF Express Type B cards to get yourself through a full shoot day. The media slots also not being redundant might be a deal breaker for many types of professional jobs. I don't want to harp on this body too much though, because Blackmagic has already provided a solution to a lot of these points by releasing the Blackmagic Pixis, a box style camera that solves a lot of these physical shortcomings. It's clear to me that the main reason this camera even exists is that they already had the manufacturing process for this body, so it was the fastest and most cost-effective way for Blackmagic to get a full frame camera on the market as soon as possible. Blackmagic also sent over their optional EVF and battery grip for testing. The EVF is solid if you're the kind of person who wants to run this camera without an external monitor. It's not the sharpest EVF I've ever used, but it does the job. Personally though, I preferred the onboard 5-inch display and opted to use that the majority of the time I tested the camera on its own. I will also note that both displays had some slight discrepancies in what I saw on board versus how the footage looked in post, so just keep that in mind. The battery grip is also not an accessory that I can recommend because adding vertical height to a camera that is primarily shooting video usually causes more issues than it solves in my experience, particularly in this case where handheld operation is less comfortable with the grip on. When it comes to the menu and touchscreen operation, Blackmagic's menu system is still probably the simplest and easiest to use of any camera that shoots video. One change I would like to see though is I wish when going between record modes and switching to a high frame rate that it would default to the slowest available frame rate. Every time I went to the 6K open gate mode to 4K Super 35 mode, I would need to adjust the high frame rate to the max 50 FPS manually each time. This led me to missing a handful of shots when I wanted to grab something at a slower frame rate. The one thing that has always made Blackmagic stand out is their excellent image quality that to this day still punches well above its price tag. The footage from the 6K full frame is beautiful. Skin tones and colors feel rich and full of life. Detail from the full resolution 6K footage is sharp enough without ever feeling too digital, but the lenses you choose will also impact this a lot. It is unfortunate that the camera doesn't shoot internal ProRes, but I have also grown to quite like the B-Raw workflow, which is particularly easy to use since I switched to DaVinci Resolve a few years ago. And like every Blackmagic camera ever, you of course get a free copy of Resolve with purchase of this camera. For the doc project I used this on, we were shooting in a fairly wide variety of lighting scenarios for all of our interviews, and despite sometimes shooting in mixed lighting situations, I was fairly pleased with the results. Lens-wise, I used this camera with a PL to L mount adapter and actually spent a lot of time shooting in the 4x3 Super 35 mode on my doc project to better match my Ursa Mini 12K, which is also Super 35. I was surprised that I still quite liked how the footage looks in the Super 35 mode. At the same time, I did find it a bit unfortunate that the lower resolution recording options, like the 4x3 Super 35 mode that I used on this camera, just crop in on the sensor instead of oversampling from the 6K of the full sensor. But if you're opting to shoot 6K most of the time, this isn't a big deal. We shot on the Laowa Super 35mm Ranger lenses, which I will be making a separate video on in the future. So if you're interested in that, please get subscribed so you don't miss that video. Despite being a full frame camera, this isn't a camera you should expect to be able to push really hard in low light scenarios, something that no Blackmagic camera has ever really excelled at. This camera requires you to expose your shots very thoughtfully, and if you aren't careful with how you use your ISO, you can get noisy looking footage quite easily. Despite having a dual native ISO of 400 and 3200, if you decide to jump up to 3200 to protect more of your dynamic range in your highlights, footage can still look a bit on the noisy side. I was able to clean this up in Resolve, but it is definitely something to keep in mind when working with your footage in post. I think there are two ways of looking at this. You could view it as a negative that your margin for error when it comes to exposure isn't that wide, or you could view it as a positive that this camera rewards being very intentional with how you set your exposure, a practice that I think every professional should get good at regardless of what camera you use. I could make an entire video just explaining proper exposure with respect to ISO, but the short version is if you want the most out of this camera, you must understand how dynamic range relates to ISO for an ideal image, along with making sure you're giving this camera plenty of light while also not clipping your highlights. I will also quickly mention that while yes, the rolling shutter performance on this camera isn't amazing, I think that rolling shutter is generally an overblown issue in cameras, and at least for my needs, I was not really bothered by this camera's rolling shutter at all. It's not nearly as bad as some of the cameras I've used in the past. I also shot a decent amount of test footage at 6K open gate on a few full frame PL lenses I had on hand. Being able to shoot 6K open gate is awesome, especially if you find yourself in need of reframing, stabilizing, or repurposing your shots for vertical content. I do still believe this is a niche use case and most people won't end up shooting 6K open gate all the time, especially considering how much more drive space that would take up, but it's nice to have. The high frame rate options on this camera are also quite limited, only getting up to 60 FPS in 4K, which I personally find a bit disappointing. So if you're the type of person who wants to shoot a lot of high frame rate, this probably isn't the camera for you. I want to reiterate though, I really do love the image that this camera produces, and I genuinely think it stands out among cameras at this price point, as long as you're willing to be precise in your exposure decisions. The Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K excels in a professional set environment, and while I won't go so far as to say you can't use it for run and gun work, I don't actually believe that's where it shines. If you have a desire to make short films, music videos, or commercials, then the image and workflow this camera commands will probably work well for you. If you aspire to do professional film work, I think this camera is a good platform to learn how to do that better every time you use it. I don't mean that this camera alone will make your work look more cinematic. No camera really does that on its own, but it will help you along the journey to learning what it takes to produce an image that feels high quality. It's not that other cameras don't make you learn these things, but with the Blackmagic, you don't really have a choice if you want a good result when you shoot with it. This camera isn't going to hold your hand with great autofocus, in-body stabilization, crazy high ISO performance like many other full-frame cameras on the market. But if those are all features you are looking for, this camera probably is not for you despite how good the image looks. Despite every gripe I've mentioned, when it comes down to it, when I work with footage from this camera that has been properly cared for, there isn't a better image for the money on any other camera I have used, in my opinion. The color, texture, and detail is truly spectacular, especially if you have a trained eye. I think it's easy to underestimate this camera. The 6K full frame will test your patience ergonomically, but if you're willing to put in the time and effort to give this camera the environment to excel, you will be handsomely rewarded in your work. Would most people be able to tell the nuanced difference between this camera's image and any other mirrorless camera on the market with similar specs? No, probably not, but that's not what matters. The most important question to ask yourself if you are considering this camera is, can you personally tell that the image is worth it for the work that you do? Does the quality of this camera's image inspire you to do your best work every single time? That's really all that matters. This camera is for people who really care about their work looking as cinematic as possible and who don't mind spending the extra time that is necessary to reach that goal. Blackmagic has clearly always designed their cameras with filmmakers in mind, and this camera is no different. The release of the Blackmagic Pixis does seem to solve a lot of the gripes I have with this camera, and you may think it's not worth buying this camera when the Pixis exists. However, considering Blackmagic put this camera on sale below $1,600 not long ago, if you can buy one on sale or used, this is a great value for what you get, especially if you are a beginner. Personally, I think I would still lean towards the Pixis between the two myself, but you can't get a better image in any other sub $2,000 camera brand new. If you are lucky enough to get a good deal on this camera instead of a Pixis or any other camera, you could also use that extra budget you now have towards other gear that will make your work better, like lights from today's sponsor, Amaran. If you guys have been following the channel for a while, you will probably know that I've been using Amaran's lights for years. Every shot you saw in this video was lit by an Amaran fixture. Amaran recently became their own company, branching off from Aperture, and today they have a new release in the form of the Amaran app. This app brings all the core functionality of the previous app, Sidus Link, but Amaran has completely redesigned and simplified the user interface so that it is intuitive and easy to use. I actually tested it out taking photos of my cat Percy, and I was able to program in 3 different lighting looks that I could activate with a single press of a button. This worked really well and saved me a lot of time taking these photos because my cat does not like staying still. The Amaran app is available on mobile, desktop, and even has Stream Deck integration, so no matter what kind of creator you are, you have a way to fit this into your workflow in a seamless manner. If you would like to download or learn more about the app, check the first link in the video description. Thank you to Amaran for making this video possible.